Yeah, I can hear you a little bit better. Let me. We can go ahead and get started, and as long as you can hear me, that should be okay. Not too many verses tonight. I just want to follow up on the study that we looked at last time, fleeing to Zoar. You know, I wanted to review this topic again. A friend of mine, a few years back, we were looking at. I think it's. Hang on one second. We were looking at a few verses having to do with fleeing to the mountains, and somehow they were offering. That's Mark chapter 13, 14, verse 14, and Luke 21, verses 20 and 21. The language there of fleeing to the mountains. And one of the things that was proposed is that going into Zoar or going to Babylon is a salvation. And then yesterday, I'm sorry, last week when I offered that study, I was showing, or at least I was offering, the salvation side of going to Babylon, which has always been there in the Bible. But then uh, I'm still in disagreement. I'm not seeing how the Bible is looking at fleeing to the mountains as going to Babylon. So that's what was offered. It was offered that Luke 21, verses 20 and 21, the language of departing in the midst or fleeing Judah or Judea, going to Babylon. I'm sorry, going to the mountains, flee to the mountains. That's the church going to Babylon. And I disagree with that because, again, so far I don't see anything in the Bible that would speak to that. And so I want to touch on these verses again because they relate to some degree on fleeing to Zoar. And what I mentioned, something I should point out, I was kind of hesitant to label the study fleeing to Zoar. I don't see too many verses in the Bible where God uses the word flee in connection with going to Babylon. We do read quite a bit about fleeing Babylon, but not so much about going into Babylon. There is the going to Babylon, that is the believers coming to a place of safety only because it's in Babylon that God would eventually deliver them. All right, so let's look at refuge and Zoar. I'll just review real quickly here. Let me post some verses. This is the believers enduring tribulation. Okay, so going to Babylon, going to Zoar is, in my view, the beginning or the start of the Great Tribulation. Anyone disagree with that? That is the Great Tribulation. Judgment beginning at the house of God. And the focus there is how God commands that everyone is to go to Babylon because it was God's purpose, God's plan that the believers that they endure tribulation. And that's what going to Babylon was all about. So from that vantage point, it is a safe haven, like we saw with Zoar. It is a safe haven, and the believers there later on, we see how God brought the people out of Babylon. So He redeemed them from Babylon. However, fleeing to the mountains, and the context in Luke 21 and Mark 13, that's not going to Babylon. That's leaving Babylon. And that's what I had offered a few years back, and then so far nothing has changed from everything that I can see. All right, but we'll touch on some of these verses again. In Genesis 19, verse 20, behold, now this city is near to flee. Now here's a reference where God uses the word flee in talking about those that are going to, let's see, Zoar. Behold, now this city is near to flee. And the word flee can also be translated hide. So that's where they're hiding. They find safety, they find haven there. And it is a little one. Escape thither, and my soul shall live. And we saw from other language in the Bible God uses similar wording in talking about those that escape by virtue of them going to Babylon. Let's see. Now looking at verse 22, Genesis 19. Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do. Let me paste it. I cannot do anything till thou come thither. Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. And by the way, the word Zoar means insignificance. A city grouped with Sodom and Gomorrah. Isn't that interesting? That to me is interesting, and I don't think it's a coincidence. You see, Zoar is identified with Sodom and Gomorrah. So going into Zoar is not fleeing to the mountains. It's not finding eternal rest or eternal salvation in Christ, which is what those verses that I mentioned earlier. We're going to look at them in a few minutes. However, hiding in Zoar, hiding in Babylon, it is salvation in the fact that judgment begins at the house of God. It is this judgment that allows God to redeem Babylon, to redeem the church. That makes sense? So here we have Zoar, meaning insignificance, and it is a city that identifies with Sodom and Gomorrah. We also read in Isaiah 15, verse 5, my heart shall cry out from Moab, his fugitives shall flee. Now the word flee here, or the phrase shall flee, it's italicized, so it's not really in the original. Let me post it. His fugitives unto Zoar, an heifer of 3 years old, for by the mounting up of Luhith, the weeping shall they go it. Okay, so, but basically here, again, the word flee, I wanted to highlight it to see how many times God would use language of fleeing to Babylon or fleeing to Zoar. And these are the only references, I think, so far I've been able to see. If you know of any additional verses, let me know. Micah chapter 4 verse 10. Be in pain, labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. Like a woman in travail, for now shalt thou go forth out of the city, thou shalt dwell in the field, thou shalt go to Babylon, there shalt thou be delivered. Now we talked about these verses last time. At least I offered similar verses. Going to Babylon is where God redeems the church. Is where God brings back the captivity of the elect. Okay, they go into captivity in Babylon, and they become a part of Babylon. However, it was a necessary process, a necessary step in God's redemption plan, right? Because if they had not been obedient, then they all would have been destroyed. And that's why historically we see the people leaving the city. They're leaving the city and they're going to Babylon under the leadership of King Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuzaradan. And that's what I think we have here. Spiritually, again, it is looking at those that are coming into the Great Tribulation. And that's where they find safe haven until God redeems them. Jeremiah 27, verse 12. I spake also to Zedekiah, king of Judah, according to all these words, saying, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him and his people, and live. Right? So we see that. Again, this is just reviewing a couple of these verses to set the stage, and then we'll move into the redemptive stage. We read in Micah chapter 4 verse 10, be in pain, labor to bring forth, thou shalt dwell in the field, thou shalt go even to Babylon. Is that the same verse? Yeah, I'm sorry, I already posted that verse. Thou shalt go to Babylon, there shalt thou be delivered, and there the Lord shall redeem thee from the hand of thine enemies. Who are the enemies? Yeah, Antichrist, Babylon. So the believers or the church, the collective body, is going into the land of the enemy. They're being subject to Antichrist. Doesn't mean they're not saved. It's just collectively God's judgment, God's wrath comes on the entire body, right? And that's the beginning of the judgment process. They had to go to Babylon. They had to be submissive in order for God later on to redeem them. Okay, any question thus far? Let me delete this verse here. Any questions? Now, again, the focus or the target verse has to do with those now that are fleeing. They're fleeing Babylon. Depart out. Separation of wheat and tares. Can you see that? And that's where I think I had, I guess I saw the language of going to Babylon, but I had never seen it from a salvation vantage point. And so I had to go back and review the lessons, review the studies that we had talked about. And so when it was offered the second time that, yeah, Matthew, let's see, which verse is that? Mark 13, verse 14. Let me put that up on the screen. And then hopefully you guys might see what I'm talking about. But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand, and let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. So again, what my friend was offering was that fleeing to the mountains is going to Babylon. And then even today I said, no, that can't be. That's not, when we look at everything in context, this here in the following verse, let's see, Luke 21 is the same, in the same context. Okay, and hopefully that'll shed light, and as we try to differentiate between going to Zoar and going to the mountains. Luke 21 verses 20 and 21. When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountain. That's not going to Babylon again. They were in Babylon. Now they're leaving Babylon. And let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And the latter part of this verse confirms that, I believe. Because departing out has to do with not physically leaving the church, but here there is what? When we read language of departing out, we see a language, exactly, that's a command to come out of Babylon, a command to be separate, and we see it in the language of departing out. Numbers 16 verse 26, and he spake unto the congregation, saying, Depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest ye be consumed in all their sins. So historically that was true. The believers, they had to be separate from the people, and they were not to touch the unclean. And that's what I think is in view here in Luke 21. Depart out of the midst. And the Bible would seem to confirm that. And remember in Acts chapter 1 verse 4, Acts chapter 1 verse 4, we read, and being assembled together with them, commanded them that they should not depart from Jerusalem. Well, historically, departing from Jerusalem, how does that compare to those now that are leaving Jerusalem? They're leaving the corporate body. They're being called to come out of Babylon. Now, Jerusalem becomes Babylon. This is, a point that I made before. And again, I continue to see that the Bible is doing nothing more but confirming that Jerusalem becomes Babylon. We don't have Jerusalem and then Babylon separate. It's one and the same. It depends on the context of what we're reading, the language, where we are, if we're talking about going to Babylon or if we're talking about leaving Babylon at the revelation of Christ. That they should not depart from Jerusalem, but wait for the promise of the Father. Now, spiritually, this is the revelation of Christ, I believe, right? That's the time now when God unseals the Bible, so that the believers they receive knowledge, and then um, they begin to see the man of sin. They begin to see Babylon, and then now they are renewed in terms of a doctrine. Okay, here's let's see, in Matthew chapter 23 verse 37. Now, who is Jerusalem? I mentioned just now that Jerusalem becomes Babylon, right? Jerusalem is the church. It is the corporate body. But the corporate body also kills itself. It brings death and destruction upon itself. That's why we read here, Matthew 23, verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets. Well, who are the ones who kill the prophets? Who was the one who killed Abel? Yeah. Who killed Abel? His brother, right? Brother. And a man's foes will be they of his own household. So the death comes from within. Babylon destroys itself from within. So it's Jerusalem, the unsaved in the body, the tares, the wheat and tares are growing together. The unsaved in the body, they are the ones who kill the church. They kill the body. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee. Okay? So Jerusalem, departing from Jerusalem is departing from Babylon. So it's no surprise, I think, to see in Luke 21, let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, if they were in Babylon at the time, at the start of the Great Tribulation, they can't be going again into Babylon in the context of at the revelation of Christ. Another, let's see, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 14, and whosoever shall not receive you, this is language again of departing out, nor hear your words when ye depart out of that house. Again, the context here spiritually, I think, is the separation of wheat and tares. When ye depart out of that house. What house? The local church? No, no. This is, a very, that's a deep spiritual language or connection, I think, of departing out of the congregation, a separation of wheat and tares. When ye depart out of that house, the house of God, the city of God, shake off the dust off your feet. We also read and Genesis 14 verse 10. Now notice here, let's see if I can, let me read this verse. Matthew chapter 10 verse 14. Whosoever shall not receive you nor hear you, oh wait a minute, I post the same verse again. I wanted to post Genesis 14 verse 10. Genesis 14 verse 10. And the valley of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, and fell there. And they that remained fled to the mountains. So can you see again how this would appear to have the collective body in view? Jerusalem, it started off as Jerusalem, it becomes Babylon, it becomes Sodom and Gomorrah. And then now there is a command to flee, to come out. As God is judging Babylon, is judging Sodom and Gomorrah, there are those now that are finding refuge in Christ. Not in Babylon again, but they're finding refuge in Christ as they come out of Babylon. We read Luke chapter 17, verse 31. And that day he which shall be upon the housetop and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away. He that is in the field. What is the field? How does the Bible define the field? The field is the world, and the world is parabolic language for the church, correct? Right? The world, the field is the world. In that day, Luke 17:31, He which shall be upon the housetop and his stuff in the house, let him not come down and take it away. He that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Well, it doesn't mean that they're outside the local church. They're in the field. The field is the world. And there's a separation that takes place in the field. Matthew 24, verse 40. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken, and the other left. Who is the one taken? The unsaved in the church, right? The unsaved in the church. They're taken. Babylon is taken. Babylon comes into judgment. The unsaved body. Two shall be in the field, the one shall be taken, and the other left. Genesis 19, verse 17. And it came to pass, when they had brought them forth abroad, that he said, Escape, escape for thy life. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. Flee, flee to the mountains. Flee to the mountains. Escape for thy life. And Jeremiah 6, verse 1. O ye children of Benjamin, gather yourselves, flee out of the midst of Jerusalem. You see it again? That's the same language. If you're fleeing Jerusalem, are you going to Babylon? If you're fleeing Jerusalem, well, Jerusalem becomes Babylon, right? In tribulation. So you're not fleeing at the revelation of Christ. You're not fleeing. You're fleeing Babylon, but you're not going back again into Babylon. O ye children of Benjamin, gather yourselves to flee out of the midst of Jerusalem, and blow the trumpet in Tekoa. We read also in Revelation 18, verse 4. Okay, I started off earlier saying that there is a separation. Michael mentioned it is a time of the separation of wheat and tares. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people. Come out of her, my people. Well, that's fleeing to the mountains, right? That's fleeing to the mountains. Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 6. Flee out of the midst of Babylon. Okay, now you're leaving Babylon. You're fleeing to the mountains. Flee out of the midst of Babylon, and deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. Vengeance. God, the Bible says, avenge not yourselves. So God's vengeance, who is God taking vengeance on? And why is God taking vengeance? Huh? Vengeance on Babylon. But why? Because Babylon, not only that, but also because of that, because of the false gospels, because of the lies, what do they do with those lies? Well, they ended up killing the body. They killed the two witnesses, right? I'm trying to think of the verse that speaks directly to this, but the focus here is on God avenging the believers. They were not fed. God had commanded the prophets to feed the church, but the church ended up feeding itself. And because they shed blood, when that happens, just like Cain shed the blood of Abel, his brother, God took vengeance on Cain. So again, here spiritually, God is taking vengeance on those who, actually Babylon, because it's in Babylon, the believers, they were in Babylon prior to the separation. Also in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 28, the voice of them that flee and escape out of the land of Babylon. Out of the land of Babylon. To declare in Zion the vengeance of the Lord our God, the vengeance of his temple. Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 8, remove out of the midst of Babylon. So you see all this language. If you're leaving Babylon, you're fleeing, you're You're coming out, you're escaping. Where are you going? Where do the believers go when they flee Babylon? They go to be with Christ, right, spiritually. They go to be with Christ. They're not going into Babylon again. Michael posted Galatians 4:25-26. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem which is now, and is in bondage with her children, but Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. So yeah, we have Jerusalem becoming Babylon, and also becomes the eternal church. God redeems Babylon, God redeems Jerusalem. He brings back the captivity of his people. So yeah, so remove out of the midst of Babylon. Well, if you're coming out of Babylon, you're not going back into Babylon. You're leaving the unsaved church. You're leaving the false prophets. You're receiving revelation that allows you to come out of Babylon. We read, let's see, Jeremiah 51 verse 45. My people, go ye out of the midst of her, and deliver ye every man his soul from the fierce anger of the Lord. And I think I have two more verses. And here, speaking of the separation, in Matthew 25 verse 33, and he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. And that's what happens with the depart out, with the separation. And Matthew 25 verse 32, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as the shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. So there you have it. Okay, quite a bit of a lot of information, I think, a lot of language dealing with first of all, the refuge that the believers find in Babylon at the start of the Great Tribulation. And then, after the tribulation of those days, or with the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be dark and the moon shall not give her light. Now God is separating, he is bringing back the captivity. Because they went into Babylon in obedience, now God is redeeming them, he is delivering them. And that's the command, again, I believe, in Mark 13:14, Luke 21, where God now is speaking of those that are fleeing to the mountains. All right, let me post the... I have a couple of more verses here. Oh, taken by Babylon. Those were... All right, I have a couple of more verses, so bear with me one second. Those who... I think I made a typo here. All right, taken by Babylon. And we'll try to contrast that a little bit with those that are actually left in Babylon. So God brings the believers out of Babylon. Take a look at... we'll start with Luke chapter 17, verse 31. And that day he who shall be upon the housetop, and his stuff in the house, let him not come down and take it away. And he that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Matthew 24, verse 40. Then shall two be in the field. Again, we saw these verses before, but I want to get to another one here. He that is in the field, shall two be in the field, one shall be taken and the other left. Now take a look at Job chapter 15, verses 20. I think verse 20 and verse 30. And we'll stop after that. The wicked man travaileth with pain all his days, and the number of years is hidden. Who is the wicked man spiritually? Yeah, that would be, again, those who remain in Babylon. They remain unsaved. They're not receiving revelation. Look at the latter part of the verse. He shall not depart out of darkness. Who is darkness? That's Babylon again, right? The flame shall dry. So he shall not depart out of Babylon. So there are those at the revelation of Christ There are those that are coming out of Babylon. God is simultaneously, again, I believe, judging Babylon and redeeming Babylon. Where the believers now, they're fleeing to the mountains. All right, with that said, I'm also going to post, let me put the summary up, and then I'm going to post a few studies, related studies, that you can look at if you want at your own leisure. Summary conclusion. Redemption appears to be a two-step process. First, the collective body is commanded to come under the yoke of Babylon. That's going to Zoar, right? That's going to Babylon. It is in Babylon God redeems them. It is from Babylon the command comes to depart out. Separation of wheat and tares at the revelation of Christ. All right, with that said, I have 5 studies here. I think if I won't have the link, the direct link, but I'll just post the names of these studies. And I think all of them you should be able to find on the Berean Studies site. If not, you can also you can look it up on YouTube. Fleeing to Zoar, we talked about that last week. Flee to the mountains. That's I offered this study a few years back, and I also offered a study called Zoar, and then there was another one, Going to Babylon, and then Abomination of Desolation. So all of these, Lord willing, should be related. And if you find any discrepancies there or anything that would not seem to tie in to these conclusions, then you're welcome to let me know. You're welcome to offer additional verses, either corroborating it or just showing where the discrepancies might be. All right, that's the end of that. Hang on one second. Let me turn off the recorder and then we'll open for discussion.